Thank you for downloading The Luminous Mind, episode 42.
Ultimately, the takeaway message is you kind of have to customize the experience based off of where you're at in life and what kind of situation you're in.
Benjamin Franklin once said, "Do not curse the darkness, rather light a candle instead." If you're ready to set your mind on fire, then prepare yourself for the Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
Today's fire starter is Ben Greenfield. Ben is an ex-bodybuilder, Ironman triathlete, Spartan racer, coach, speaker, and author of the New York Times Bestseller, Beyond Training, Mastering Endurance, Health, and Life. In 2008, Ben was voted as NSCA's Personal Trainer of the Year, and in 2013 and 14 was named by Greatest as one of the top 100 most influential people in health and fitness. Ben blogs and podcasts and resides in Spokane, Washington with his wife and twin boys. Welcome, Ben.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Rebecca. And I guess I'll say this for you if I need to, but we are out of our element today. I think both of us in our recording, we had a nice appointment set up this morning, and I completely crashed it. I didn't really explain to you in too much detail what happened, but it looks like myself and my son River both got an ample case of food poisoning from what was likely the sausage and dinner last night. So I've spent the better part of my day eating things like activated charcoal and chia seeds and spirulina and plenty of water and kind of every detoxification compound I can get my hands on. So anyways, though, I'm bounced back now, aside from feeling a little lighter, perhaps, I suppose.
Oh boy, I'm so sorry. That's horrible. I was so worried, but I'm so thankful that you decided to go ahead and continue and got to talk to you. So normally at this time of day, me and my sons would be outside doing a workout together. It's kind of like our afternoon thing. But this turns out to be a time that I'd rather just be lying around podcasting with you instead. Well, that's good. We'll move along, and so that hopefully we don't spend too much of your family time. But do you want to go ahead and briefly tell us about yourself, kind of about your family, and obviously your hobbies, passion, and then your profession?
Well, yeah, my profession now is as an author. For about a decade prior to that, I was a personal trainer. When my children were born about 7 years ago, I made the decision to move from traditional kind of like brick and mortar personal training, running gyms and studios in Idaho and in Washington, to instead do a lot more online training, exercise program and exercise plan creation and sales online, and things that would allow me to stay at home with my kids and homeschool them and spend the time with them that I knew I wouldn't be able to spend with as much as I was rushing around at my oddly houred gym job. So,
cool.
Fast forward 7 years later, and I'm still kind of doing what I did then, creating content, writing articles, freelancing for magazines and websites, writing books, podcasting, blogging, and basically trying to spread the message to people that they can really live at a pretty optimum level of human performance as long as they do the right things. And so I work with everybody from professional athletes to weekend warriors to folks who just want to live a little longer or look a little better. So
that's awesome.
That's the deal. So it's just me and my wife and our twin boys, and we live in Washington State.
Well, that's cool. So one of the reasons why I had Ben on is I was listening to another podcast, and he had mentioned that he was homeschooled. And so I wanted to kind of discuss how his homeschooling life kind of helped prepare him for the life that he has now. So do you kind of want to give us your personal educational experience, kind of what that was like as a kid?
Yeah, I was homeschooled K through 12 with a little bit of, I remember I was one of the first kids to ever try like online learning, right? We used these classrooms called See You, See Me, and I took a little bit of classical education online, some Latin, logic, rhetoric, things like that, and was actually a very, very early adopter of the whole online learning. This would have been, I guess, 95, 96, around in there. So,
that's awesome.
But most of it was essentially my parents purchasing curriculum. And, in the early days, of course, my mom, more than my dad, my mom was just kind of stay at home, full-time homeschooler. She'd walk us through the curriculum. And probably after about sixth grade or so, I was an extremely independent learner. And so, I would just take the curriculum and go into my room, and I'd be in my room for 3 or 4 hours going through everything. I'd come out, I'd mark it as complete, and off I went to enjoy the rest of the day and, go hike around in the hills. So, I don't think that approach works for everybody. I do not endorse that approach. Do as I say, not as I do. But, it worked for me, right? Because I was a voracious learner. I still am. Like, you hand me a book and I will go read it. I know that that's not the case with some folks, but you don't have to twist my arm or tell me twice to go learn something or educate myself. Because of that, I never really have enjoyed classrooms too much. But ultimately, that was how my education was run. It didn't work out quite as well for my brothers and my sisters, that approach. I think that they probably needed more of, like, if they were going to be homeschooled, more of the tutoring, more of the outsourcing of the education, if it can't be done by the parents, to people in the local community, piano teachers, math tutors, people like that, along with more intensive online curriculum. For me, I did a little less of the online curriculum and the tutoring, and a little bit more of just learning by myself on my own, figuring it out.
That is great. So do you know why your parents chose to homeschool you?
Well, both of them had unpleasant public school education experiences, everything from bullying to abuse, et cetera, and a lot of things that kind of left a nasty taste in their mouth from that standpoint. And my parents were extremely, extremely conservative, right? Religious, conservative, really wanting to be careful about the world views that their children were exposed to and taught. And so, because they weren't necessarily a wealthy family and couldn't afford some kind of a private school that might offer some of those things, they wound up homeschooling us and mixing it up with some of those other things that I just described. But ultimately, that was, as best as I could understand, kind of the main reason that they made that choice.
Oh, that's great. So you said that, what's your sibling, your makeup? Are you the first one, or are you somewhere
No,
in
I've got 2 brothers and 2 sisters. So
okay. And
I am the second born son.
Oh, wow. And you're that much of a self-directed learner. I find my oldest one is probably my most self-directed, so that's pretty cool. So can you tell us, you talked about kind of online learning and stuff. What was their philosophy? Did they try just turning you loose or using a formal curriculum, or, what was the philosophy behind it?
And I could totally butcher these curriculums because I'm thinking back, I'm 32 years old, so I'm thinking back a little while ago. I'm not like, it's not like decades and decades ago. But we would use like the Saxon math curriculum. I believe it was Abeka books was another one that we used. There was a lot of kind of like the classical education kind of stuff in there, like the Great Books curriculum. A lot of stuff from like Usborne books. I remember back in the day, my parents would drag me around to like the homeschooling fairs and the book fairs and, talk to people and dial in curriculum. They weren't totally cowboying it, right? Like they were actually ordering curriculum, and we homeschooled our children for 2 years. And, I can certainly tell you about the type of things that we used. It wasn't exactly what I've just described, but yeah, they used curriculum.
Oh, that's great. And then how has your feeling about education kind of changed over time? Did you enjoy it as a kid? Is it something that you planned on doing with your family, or, what's your feeling about that, about your education?
I think my parents did a pretty good job getting us out in the local community, doing everything from volunteering every week to playing baseball, basketball, football, soccer. We were heavily involved in the local tennis community. And so it's not like we were, anything. And I know this isn't so stereotypical anymore, but it's still like slightly stereotypical, like the isolated kids living out in the woods, never getting, much of a social experience because it's such a far drive into town. We were very well socialized growing up. And so I think that approach, combined with some semblance of a curriculum and the lucky fact that I was an independent learner anyways, turned out to work out pretty well for me. And I feel like it got me relatively well prepared for everything except, I would say, being a team player, right? Like a lot of times people will rail against a conventional schooling system, a classroom setting, by saying that it creates drones or factory workers. But that might be the con if a child isn't also wired up with some entrepreneurial and business sense. But it also teaches kids how to be team players, right? Like when you're surrounded by a classroom of peers that you have to work closely with. And I would say that's still one of the things that I struggle with, right? Because of that element of my education was missing. I'm more individualistic. I'm less of a team player. I don't do well with teams. I do better in individual sports where teammates aren't relying upon me. I do better in business situations where I'm not having to meet with a team or be reliant upon a team. I don't do well in LLC partnerships compared to like LLC solo entrepreneurial activities. So, I would say that if I could identify one weakness, and this is a weakness in a lot of homeschooling settings, it would be that. It's not like that can't be recreated in some alternative educational settings, such as like a central school where I forget the name of it, but it's like a local school where a lot of like the parents can be involved as teachers,
like co-ops or
that's exactly
academies.
A co-op,
Yeah.
Exactly. But I think that would be like the biggest shortcoming that I experienced.
So there probably wasn't a lot of that when you were growing up. I mean, there's way more of that now, but not a lot of like leadership or.
And my parents were like leaders in the local homeschooling community, and they'd have parties and get-togethers all the time at our house. So we were surrounded by kids a lot. And for the first 2 years that I homeschooled my children, we did the same thing, right? They were at the YMCA camps all the time. They were playing 3 different sports. They were enrolled in as many situations as possible to help get them exposure to both social situations and team interaction. But I still identified in them, even though we were using, like a good, we used the 5 in a row curriculum, and we also used the Sunlight curriculum with them. I really enjoyed the curriculum, but at the same time, I felt that down the road, the outsourcing of their education was going to become necessary, right? Like I didn't really want to relearn calculus, and was even struggling to, with piano lessons to stay ahead of them in that respect. And thinking down that far, I realized that if my children were going to be in some kind of a situation learning from an outsourced instructor, that I'd rather have them learning with the peers that they might be exposed to early on in life. And that led to reason number 2, that I shifted them out of a totally homeschooled education. It's because I wanted them to get a chance to work with their peers on a daily basis in a problem-solving situation and get to experience what, really life is like in many, many situations in the world, which is having to work with peers and not necessarily being completely solo and dependent on yourself. And so that was another reason. And then I also I felt like I could serve my children better teaching them things like breathing, meditation, yoga, physical fitness, nutrition, adventure exploring, wilderness survival, all of these things that I'm good at and that I have a specialized series of knowledge about. And that if I outsourced their education into a private school setting, which is what we wound up doing, then when they got home at 3:50 p.m. in the afternoon, my part of the homeschooling begins. And I take them out and I teach them all these things that I'm really good at teaching them and would rather be devoting my teaching energies towards. So our kids now go to a private school. It's on about 120-acre campus and they're very open-minded. Like they let me invest in and put like standing desks in some of the classrooms.
Oh, that's
so
cool.
Kids have the option of like sitting and standing, and they're very into outdoors activity. And they have things like archery and rowing, and the PE is CrossFit, and so it's a little bit more kind of forward thinking. They host the local TED Talks. It's just like that kind of school. So and I'm very comfortable with my kids there, and I go there on Wednesdays to volunteer and kind of be immersed in where they're at and what they're doing. And so that's kind of how things have evolved for me. I've realized that sometimes in some situations, completely homeschooling is not the best option. And the other thing is, to be perfectly frank with you, Mom is not much of a teacher. She's mildly dyslexic, and that's just, because the way that she learned to read and write and spell. And so it's very difficult for her to teach in that sense. And then she also just, it's not, she doesn't feel that it's her calling. Like she doesn't necessarily feel super comfortable teaching. I feel really comfortable teaching, but then I'm also running,
a
3 different corporations right now. And so,
yeah.
ultimately the takeaway message is you kind of have to customize the experience based off of where you're at in life and what kind of situation you're in. And the other thing is that once our kids started private schooling, Mom started working with me, right? And that really helps out, pay the bills of the outsourcing that we're now paying for rather than homeschooling ourselves. So
that's true. Well, and I really respect how you're at least looking around. A lot of people just think that there's just 2 ways of doing it. You either homeschool or you do the traditional public school, but you actually, looked around for maybe an education that would better fit your children as well, looking at what they are and what you want out of their education. So that's pretty awesome.
Before we go on, let us take a minute and hear about our sponsors.
Hey, Firestarters, are you looking for a new way to listen to the Luminous Mind? Try listening on Stitcher. Haven't heard of Stitcher? Think of it as radio on demand. You can listen to the Luminous Mind anytime, anywhere. There is no downloading, no syncing, no wasted memory. Just stream your favorite podcasts such as the Luminous Mind. Stitcher is available on iOS, Android, Nook, iPad, and also from your favorite internet browser. Don't have Stitcher? Download it free today at Stitcher.com or in the App Store. And make sure you rate and review the Luminous Mind so together we can continue to light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education.
Back to the Luminous Mind with Ben Greenfield.
So we talked a little bit about socialization. What were some of the big obstacles that you faced as a child, and what did you learn from those?
For me, I'm such a wired introvert, was a wired introvert, grew up being perfectly happy, curled up in my room for 4 hours reading a book and not seeing anyone at all, to the point where my folks would have to coax me out of the bedroom to even shake the hands of visitors that came over. I didn't care. I was always one of those kids. I wanted very few close friends, and that was it. Wasn't a big fan of groups, clans, big parties. I really liked more the one-on-one interactions or the smaller things. And so for me, I had almost too much social exposure with as many different sporting events and homeschool meetings and, volunteering and field trips and all the things that my parents exposed me to. So I feel like, for me, it was, there was enough and more than enough, and felt like I got a really good social experience out of it. I think probably I would say that's mostly my mom's doing. She's extremely extroverted and just always needs to be around people. And so, she created a lot of those opportunities for herself and for her kids. So the social thing was never really an issue. And I found that when my kids, for their first 2 years here, it was never hard for me any single day of the week to find a gymnastics class or a basketball club or a special field trip or some activity going on at the local library. The chance for my kids to get out and meet people and hang out with people, it was not like I sat back and waited for those things to happen. I proactively went out and found them, but they're all over in your community.
Yeah, you almost sometimes can be too busy.
Exactly.
Yeah. So do you feel like that's an obstacle maybe, that there's just too much going on? Or
It was for a while, and now I've grown to accept, for example, my kids are not in soccer or basketball right now. And part of me is I want them to be learning soccer and basketball, but at the same time, they're doing tennis and piano and theater. And it's you know what? That's enough for now.
Yeah.
And, soccer and basketball are not going anywhere. And it's okay to be, I think that you definitely don't want to focus on just one thing, because then you get like the Andre Agassi kid, right, who plays one thing really, really well and then resents his entire upbringing because that's all his parents ever focused on. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the kids who do a really, really kind of like crappy job at a lot of stuff because their parents are rushing them around to so many things that the kids almost never even get a chance to just like focus in on and get good at one thing. And the parents are super stressed too. And then you've kind of got that sweet spot where you pick a handful of things that present your child with a pretty good range of movements, right? Like a fine motor skill thing, such as ping pong, and then maybe a larger motor skill like tennis, and then some type of a musical instrument, some type of a creativity like creative writing or theater, and then the occasional field trip. And that's like kind of a doable sweet spot. It's like 4 or 5 kind of activities that they might be involved in. And I think much more than that, and you get to the point where there's a trade-off. Even though there's always that pressure, right, to do more with the kids, I think it's okay to step back a little bit and say, okay, we're going to be pretty dang good at a handful of things.
Well, and you want to find things that they like. I mean, like you said, Andrea Agassi, if his parents are making him do it because they're kind of living through him, that's not, I mean, you don't want to live that kind of life with your child, that you're selecting those things for him versus him really enjoying them and doing them because he loves them. So how do you feel your homeschooling prepared you for life? Maybe we kind of talked about that, but what successes did you see because of that experience growing up?
There's a lot of things, obviously. I mean, I graduated high school when I was 16, so I had some extra years to, study and make myself better and graduate at an earlier age and just kind of like be a little bit of a step ahead. It's certainly, in an era where we've now got iTunes University, the blogosphere, Udemy, you name the, Khan Academy, all the other online learning platforms. For me, that's awesome because I'm so used to just picking and choosing what I want to learn that I am still learning, right? Like I've never stopped learning. And I think that's because I just grew up just understanding that if you want to learn something, you just freaking go learn it. And so, I don't really hire instructors and coaches, and I probably save a lot of money, right? Because I just go out and learn it myself. Guitar, I use YouTube. So, that's certainly helped me out as well. And then just that creative thinking, the thinking outside the box, that willingness to not necessarily be the fish that swims in the same direction as all the others has helped me from a branding standpoint. I mean, a big part of my business is based around the fact that I'm not the guy who's willing to settle for people just being fit and looking good on the outside, but that I'm engaged in looking at their biology, their blood, their biomarkers, how they're looking, feeling, and performing on the inside so that someone has like the ultimate combination of longevity and performance and, physical and mental well-being. And, that's how I've always been, just like thinking outside the box like that when it comes to the way that I present myself, and sometimes to my wife's chagrin, the way I dress too. But ultimately, I think those are some of the biggest advantages that homeschooling gave me.
Yeah. And how did you move into your business? I mean, when you talk about graduating early and everything, was that kind of hard as a younger person, or did you find that, you were emotionally and all that ready to start, being your own entrepreneur? Have you ever worked for anybody or?
Yeah, I have. And, I was a real go-getter in college. I taught sports camps and worked in the wellness program and, had 3 other jobs on the side, working as a personal trainer, working at a coffee shop, working at a bakery. I averaged 25 credits a semester doing all that. I mean,
Holy cow.
I was a real go-getter. And so for me, I feel like I was kind of always trying to be ahead of the curve anyway. So I was perfectly happy. Now, I would say that there were some social situations where I didn't do as well as, say, like if I'd been wired up a different way or been able to perform like a rock star socially because I was the same age as my peers. I'd get into situations at parties and things like that where I'd feel a little bit young, but ultimately it really wasn't that big of a deal in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes I wonder, like some of those homeschool kids, I just watch my kids and they seem about 2 years older than their peers. And they just take things a lot more serious than their own. They have a hard time even relating with kids their same age because they're like, my son came home last night and it's like he's into medicine and learning how to, take care of people, and everyone around him is talking about the motorcycle riding or the, just the goof off kid stuff, and he doesn't quite get that. So is that kind of how you felt then? Maybe you just didn't understand your own peers, but felt better with older people.
That's exactly. I always like to hang out with the older people. That was exactly how it was, because I just felt like the other kids were like just a little bit like behind somehow. So yeah. And I mean, certainly, you could twist that either way. You could say, well, that creates an antisocial sentiment, or you could say, well, maybe that's a little bit of the part of you are the equivalent of like the 5 people that you hang out with, right? And so if you're hanging out with older, smarter people, you're technically going to be ahead of the curve and maybe smarter.
Exactly. So that's great. So what were some benefits, do you feel like? Maybe we kind of touched on that a little bit. Do you recognize some benefits that you gleaned
from being homeschooled?
Yeah,
I'd say we've probably covered a lot of them. I mean, really, like those are some of the main ones. Yeah.
Growing up in the homeschool community, do you feel like there are ways that parents don't, prepare their children very well, or academically, socially? I mean, what are some ways you think parents could do a better job of preparing their children?
Sure, I'd say a few parents who homeschool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say in addition to some of the insight I've given from a social standpoint, one would be to realize that homeschooling does not mean a radical version of unschooling or free schooling in which kids just get kicked out the door to fend for themselves all day long. If it's not really uncomfortable for you every day to be homeschooling, meaning stretching you mentally and probably stretching you physically, then you're likely not doing that great of a job. So I think that it's easy for some parents to get stuck in a lazy mentality and say, "Oh, we're homeschooling," and the kids are out discovering worms and butterflies and how the world works, and the parents can, go work or sit inside and get things done, but not really be doing as much of a job of schooling. So I would say, don't get stuck in that mentality. Understand that it's going to be challenging and you will be pushed if you're truly doing a good job homeschooling and making it formal enough to where your child learns in a structured way that you can actually track and be aware of. Another thing I would say is that it would be prudent to make sure that you get out into your local community and find opportunities that go outside of your normal set of peers that might be in the neighborhood, for example. And again, I touched on that already, but it's so easy to do via libraries, museums, field trips, etc. And I'm probably preaching to the choir for some of that. Those are a few of the biggies, really. I mean, I guess the last thing is there's really good curriculum out there. Like I mentioned, there's like the 5 in a row. That was one we found that we really liked. We also really liked the reviews and the thinking behind the Sunlight curriculum. So what I did actually to get my curriculum together was, rather than buying all the books from the packaged folks who were selling them as part of those curriculums, I just hired an online VA. You know how there's all these virtual assistant websites now where you can hire people online to do things for you?
Yeah.
Like Fetch is one, or you can go to like Elance or whatever. I hired somebody, a VA, and just gave them a task of finding the entire curriculum used on eBay, and they'd go book by book, and it cost me $25 to hire them to do that, and I'd save hundreds of dollars in books. So that was my little trick for getting books, was I outsourced the process of finding the best deal on books. But having a structured curriculum, it doesn't have to be super duper expensive if you do things like that.
Yeah, well, and like you said, technology is taking us to a place where it's easy to get the education you want almost for free. I mean, you have classes, MIT classes, and some of those classes that you can get online. It's so much cheaper than what we're used to in the past. So
yep, exactly.
That's pretty cool. And if you're willing to be a self-directed learner, the sky's the limit in that regard. So
yep.
So what long-term goals do you have for yourself and for your family? I mean, your boys are pretty young, aren't they? Your twins?
Yeah, they're 7.
They're 7. Okay.
Yeah. Long-term goals, you mean like career goals or?
Well, goals, either that, you can tell us those type of things, and then also what you hope to accomplish with your family.
Yeah, well, we're basically kind of creating a little homestead here with, goats and chickens and lots of raised garden beds and a giant obstacle course, and we've got all this land out here in Washington, and we're trying to achieve a little bit of self-sustainability and the ability to teach our children how to do the farm chores and the yard chores and kind of learn how to work hard. And I'm just as happy as a clam kind of working more on building up my personal homestead as I am about making millions and millions of dollars in my business or something like that. I'm one of those guys who you give me enough money to live comfortably wherever I'm located, and I'm good. I'm not really driven by building a massive empire. And so that's that. Having a little homestead here motivates me a lot more than building, again, something like an Amazon, or whatever. So, that's one thing. And then from a professional standpoint, my goal is to really just continue to work on getting my business to the point where I'm doing just the things that I'm good at. And for me, that's the number one thing, is just writing. I just really want to be able to churn out another book. And one of the ones I'm actually working on right now with an agent is called Beyond Parenting. And it's a book that delves into a lot of the concepts of how to strengthen a child's immune system, bone density, facial symmetry, all those type of things that might give them a little bit of a leg up in life. And then also, all the different considerations out there for everything from vaccinations and medical care to, some of the educational things that we've talked about today, to just a vast range of topics on all of the things that go above and beyond just the typical parenting advice that you see out there.
Well, and that's really a needed book. I mean, our society is just getting more unhealthy all the time. And so, especially for children, childhood obesity is just becoming an epidemic almost. So I wish you the best of luck on that. That sounds wonderful. So if you could leave a legacy, I mean, we kind of talked about your homestead and what you're doing with your boys, but if you could leave a legacy, what would it be?
If I could leave a legacy, I would say that I want to raise up 2 children, this time 2, who will be able to make the world a better place, and who will understand that making the world a better place is not about necessarily success, right? It's about relationships and love and community and giving and living by the golden rule. And so, I of course desire good financial success for my family, but would be, just as happy if my kids turn out to be whatever, a male version of Mother Teresa, right? Like I want kids who really have the ultimate goal, no matter what the cost, of helping to leave the world a better place than they found it.
Yeah. Hopefully that's what, when we're doing education, that's what it's for. I was talking to somebody that, they said, what good is education if it's used for bad purposes?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we want people that do better things and make the world a better place. So great. So before we say goodbye, do you have any final parting words of advice? And please give us your contact information. I think as a standpoint of all your health and fitness and training, that you could be a huge asset to our parents.
Yeah, I mean, really, most of what I do you can find at bengreenfieldfitness.com. If you click through to there, you can find some books I've written on, I've got one called How to Raise Tiny Superhumans, which is kind of like a small ebook guide with some of my little tips and tricks. I've got one about healthy homesteading, it's called How to Biohack a Healthy Home. And there's a few resources on there. So you just go to bengreenfieldfitness.com, and I think there's a store link or there's something on the menu there. I'm sure you can find it, and you can contact me through there too. So that's probably a good place to go. I'll make it easy. Just one URL to remember.
Great. And do you have any parting words that you want to say?
Parting words would be, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And obviously, I think that the current educational system in America meets that definition pretty well as far as the conventional educational approach. And so I think that as much as you can think outside the box and be slightly less insane with your approach to education, the better off you're going to be. So don't be afraid to just get freaking creative, and don't think there's just one way to do things.
Exactly. I will back that. So great. Well, thank you so much for joining us and for taking the time, and rescheduling with me and all that. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Rebecca.
Thanks for listening to The Luminous Mind. To learn more about Ben Greenfield and to check out his books, go to our show notes at theluminousmind.net. Also, be sure to become a subscriber to our free email list so you can receive our weekly audio blog, The Spark. We would love to have you join our program. Do so by going to the scheduling tab to become a fire starter today. Help support the podcast by making all your Amazon purchases through the free Amazon widget on our website, theluminousmind.net. Also, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Google+. Get our audio content on YouTube, iTunes, and Stitcher. Leave us a review. Tell us how we can help you so together we can continue to light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education.